The inbred family of the Appalachian Hills, 7 generations trapped by a cursed genetic bloodline. This is the haunting reality of the Calloway family, a name that would become synonymous with one of the most disturbing cases of familial isolation ever documented in American history. It was late autumn of 1978 when social worker Margaret Henderson first received a call that would change her life forever. A concerned neighbor in Harlan County, Kentucky, deep in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, reported seeing children who didn't look right playing in the yard of an isolated farmhouse at the end of a dirt road that seemed to lead nowhere. Margaret, a 28-year-old graduate from the University of Kentucky, had seen her share of poverty and neglect in these mountains, but nothing could prepare her for what she was about to encounter. The drive to the Calloway property took nearly 2 hours from the county office. The narrow road twisted through dense forests of oak and pine, where the autumn leaves created a canopy so thick that even at midday the sunlight struggled to penetrate. The temperature that November morning hovered around 45 degrees Fahrenheit, and a persistent mist clung to the hillsides, giving the landscape an otherworldly, almost suffocating atmosphere. This was Appalachia at its most isolated, where families had lived for generations without interference from the outside world, where old ways persisted and where secrets could be buried as deep as the coal mines that scarred the earth. When Margaret finally arrived at the property, she was struck by the eerie silence. The farmhouse, a weathered wooden structure that looked like it hadn't seen a coat of paint since the Great Depression, sat at the center of approximately 40 acres of overgrown land. Rusted farm equipment dotted the property like forgotten monuments to a more prosperous time. The yard was littered with debris, old car parts, broken furniture, and what appeared to be animal bones. Then she saw them. 3 children, ranging in age from what appeared to be 5 to 12 years old, stood motionless near the porch, staring at her with vacant expressions. Margaret's medical training immediately recognized something profoundly wrong. The oldest child, a boy, had a severely misshapen skull, with his forehead protruding forward in an unnatural manner. His eyes were set unusually far apart, a condition known in medical literature as hypertelorism. The middle child, a girl, had what appeared to be a cleft palate that had never been surgically corrected, causing her mouth to remain partially open, revealing malformed teeth. The youngest displayed signs of microcephaly, his head noticeably smaller than normal for his age, indicating severe developmental issues. As Margaret approached slowly, speaking in soft, reassuring tones, an elderly woman emerged from the house. She introduced herself as Delilah Calloway, born in 1902, making her 76 years old at the time of this encounter. Delilah's appearance was equally troubling. She walked with a pronounced limp, her spine curved in an unnatural S shape, and her hands were gnarled with what looked like severe arthritis. Though Margaret would later learn that some of the bone deformities were genetic rather than age-related. "We don't get visitors up here," Delilah said, her voice carrying a mixture of suspicion and resignation. "Ain't nobody's business how we live." Margaret explained her purpose, emphasizing her concern for the children's welfare. Delilah reluctantly invited her inside, and what Margaret discovered in that house would haunt her for the rest of her career. The interior was dark, lit only by kerosene lamps despite electricity lines running to other homes in the area. The smell was overwhelming, a mixture of unwashed bodies, rotting food, and something else Margaret couldn't quite identify, something medicinal and sick. Inside, she counted 11 people living in the 4-room house. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light, Margaret began to document what she saw. A man in his 50s sat in a corner, rocking back and forth, making guttural sounds. Delilah identified him as her son, Thomas, explaining that he had never been right in the head since birth. 2 teenage girls, both pregnant, sat on a worn couch, their bellies swollen beneath dirty dresses. Their facial features bore striking similarities to the children outside, the same wide-set eyes, the same protruding foreheads. Quote, Margaret's training told her she was looking at a textbook case of inbreeding depression, the accumulation of harmful genetic mutations resulting from generations of reproduction between close relatives. But the scope of what she was witnessing went beyond anything she had studied in her university courses. Over the next 3 hours, Delilah, perhaps sensing that her family's secret was finally exposed, began to tell their story. She spoke in the thick Appalachian dialect of the region, her words painting a picture of isolation so complete that it seemed impossible in modern America. The Calloway family had settled in these mountains in 1847 when Jonathan Calloway, Delilah's great-great-grandfather, purchased the land for $27. Jonathan had brought with him his wife Sarah and their 6 children, seeking to escape what he called the corruption of town living in Virginia. The family established a farm, raised livestock, and for the first few decades maintained relatively normal connections with neighboring communities. But something changed in the 1880s. Delilah's grandmother had told her stories of a conflict with neighboring families, something about disputed land boundaries and stolen livestock. The details had become murky over time, filtered through generations of oral history, but the result was clear. The Calloway family retreated into themselves. They stopped attending the local church. They stopped trading at the general store. They stopped socializing at community gatherings. By the early 1900s, the isolation had become absolute. And with that isolation came a practice that would doom their bloodline. Cousins began marrying cousins. Brothers and sisters formed unions that produced children. When Delilah spoke of her own parents, she referred to them simply as Ma and Pa, never elaborating on their relationship, but the implication was clear in the way she avoided Margaret's probing questions. "We kept the family pure," Delilah said, using a phrase that made Margaret's skin crawl. "Outsiders bring trouble. We learned that long ago. Better to keep to our own, keep the land and the family. Keep the name clean." Margaret asked about the children's parents, and Delilah pointed to various adults in the house. But the relationships she described were so tangled that Margaret struggled to map them out. The pregnant teenagers, she learned, were actually sisters who were expecting children by their own brother. A 20-year-old man named Jacob who sat near the wood stove, seemingly oblivious to the conversation happening around him. The medical implications of what Delilah was describing were staggering. 7 generations of systematic inbreeding had created what geneticists would later calculate as a coefficient of inbreeding approaching 0.5, a number typically only seen in laboratory experiments with isolated animal populations. To put this in perspective, first cousins who have children together produce offspring with a coefficient of inbreeding of 0.0625. The Calloway children were the genetic equivalent of siblings reproducing with siblings repeatedly over nearly a century and a half. Margaret asked about infant mortality, and Delilah's response was chilling in its casual delivery. "Most babies born here don't make it past their first winter," she said. "The weak ones die off. That's natural. The ones that survive are meant to be here, when pressed for numbers." Delilah estimated that for every child who survived to age 5, 3 or 4 had died in infancy. She led Margaret to a small family cemetery on the property where crude wooden markers and simple stone cairns numbered in the dozens, marking the graves of infants and children who had succumbed to the genetic lottery they never had a chance to win. As the afternoon wore on, Margaret documented everything she could. She took notes on the physical conditions of each family member. The man in the corner, Thomas, had severe intellectual disabilities and required constant care. A woman in her 30s, Emily Calloway, was blind. Her eyes clouded with cataracts that should have been operable but had never received medical attention. Several of the children displayed varying degrees of hearing loss. Almost all family members had dental problems so severe that eating solid food was difficult. Their teeth rotted or malformed from birth. But it was the skeletal abnormalities that were most visible and most disturbing. Multiple family members walked with pronounced limps, their leg bones bowed or fused at abnormal angles. Several had club feet, their ankles twisted inward, forcing them to walk on the sides of their feet. The spinal deformities were common, with at least 5 family members displaying severe scoliosis or kyphosis. Margaret asked about medical care, and Delilah explained that they had avoided doctors for as long as she could remember. "Doctors ask too many questions," she said. "They want to take the children away, put them in institutions. We take care of our own." When children or adults fell seriously ill, they relied on home remedies passed down through generations. Poultices made from local plants, teas brewed from tree bark, prayer and faith that God would heal those he deemed worthy. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the property, Margaret knew she had to make a difficult decision. The conditions she had documented clearly constituted neglect, but the situation was far more complex than anything covered in her training. These were not parents who were deliberately harming their children through malicious intent. They were victims themselves, trapped in a cycle of genetic deterioration and cultural isolation that had begun long before any of them were born. Before she left that evening, Margaret spoke with the oldest capable adults, trying to explain the situation in terms they might understand. She talked about the importance of fresh blood, using agricultural metaphors she hoped would resonate with their farming background. She explained that just as livestock need to be bred with animals from other farms to stay healthy, People too need partners from outside their immediate family. Delilah listened but shook her head. You don't understand our ways, she said. We've survived this long by staying together. You people from town, you think you know better, but you don't live up here. You don't know what it's like to be on your own, to have only your family to depend on. Margaret left the Calloway property as darkness fell, her mind reeling from what she had witnessed. She drove back to town through the winding mountain roads, the headlights of her car cutting through the thick fog that had settled over the valleys. She knew that what she had seen that day would require immediate action, but she also understood that unraveling 7 generations of inbreeding and isolation would be a task that extended far beyond her authority as a social worker. That night, in her small apartment in Harlan, Margaret sat at her typewriter and began writing her report. She documented everything: the physical conditions, the family relationships, the living conditions, and the clear signs of ongoing reproductive practices that would only deepen the genetic crisis. She concluded her report with a recommendation for immediate intervention, but she also included a note that would prove prophetic. This family represents a tragedy that has been building for over a century. Any intervention now will be too late for many, but may save future generations from the same fate. Confira se Jaya inscrito nest. Canal. Because the darkest secrets of humanity's genetic legacy are hidden in stories like these, and you won't find them anywhere else. The truth is more disturbing than fiction. Within 48 hours of Margaret Henderson's report reaching the Kentucky Department of Human Services, a full investigation team was assembled. This was November 1978, and the bureaucratic wheels, though slow, were beginning to turn. The team consisted of Margaret, 2 additional social workers, a physician from the county hospital named Dr. Robert Chun, and Sheriff Daniel McCormick, whose jurisdiction included the remote area where the Calloway family lived. Dr. Chun, a 43-year-old physician who had moved to Kentucky from San Francisco 5 years earlier, brought with him a level of medical expertise rarely seen in rural Appalachia. He had completed his residency at the University of California Medical Center and had published several papers on genetic disorders. When he reviewed Margaret's initial report, he immediately recognized the signs of what medical literature was beginning to call founder effect and inbreeding depression. The team returned to the Calloway property on November 18, 1978, a cold Saturday morning when frost covered the ground and their breath formed white clouds in the freezing air. This time they came with legal authority, a court order granting them access to examine all family members and assess the living conditions. Sheriff McCormick carried the paperwork. Though everyone understood that in these remote mountains, legal documents meant little compared to the trust they would need to build with the family, Delilah Calloway met them at the door, her expression a mixture of anger and fear. "I knew you'd come back," she said. "I'd told the others you'd bring more people. You're going to take them away, aren't you? You're going to tear this family apart." Dr. Chun stepped forward, his voice calm and professional. "Mrs. Calloway, we're here to help. We need to examine everyone in the house, understand their medical conditions. Some of these conditions can be treated. The children especially need help." What followed was 6 hours of intensive medical examination. Dr. Chun set up a makeshift examination area in the family's main room, using a kerosene lamp and his flashlight to provide adequate lighting. One by one, family members were examined, their conditions documented with clinical precision. The findings were more severe than even Margaret's initial report had suggested. Dr. Chun discovered that the 3 youngest children, ages 2, 4, and 6, all suffered from profound developmental delays. The 2-year-old, a boy named Samuel, could not walk or speak, his muscle tone so poor that he could barely hold his head upright. The 4-year-old girl, Ruth, could walk but only in an unsteady stumble, and she had never spoken a word. The 6-year-old Caleb functioned at approximately the level of a 2-year-old, unable to communicate beyond grunts and simple gestures. The skeletal surveys revealed patterns of bone development that Dr. Chun had only seen in medical textbooks. Multiple family members displayed what's known as mandibular prognathism, where the lower jaw extends far beyond the upper jaw, creating severe bite problems and difficulty eating. 3 of the teenagers had fused vertebrae in their necks and spines, limiting their range of motion and causing chronic pain. 2 of the adult males, brothers aged 34 and 38, both had club feet so severe that they had never been able to wear normal shoes, instead wrapping their feet in cloth and leather scraps. But it was the neurological issues that concerned Dr. Chun most. At least 8 family members showed signs of significant intellectual disability, their cognitive function so impaired that they required constant supervision for even basic tasks. The degree of impairment varied, from mild learning difficulties to profound intellectual disability where individuals could not communicate, feed themselves, or control their bodily functions. During the examinations, Dr. Chun attempted to construct a family tree, asking each adult to explain their relationship to the others. What emerged was a genealogical nightmare. Delilah, the matriarch, was the product of a union between first cousins. Her husband, who had died in 1965, had been her second cousin. Their children had then reproduced with each other and with other close relatives. One particularly disturbing revelation came when Dr. Chun examined the two pregnant teenagers, Sarah and Martha, ages 15 and 17. When he asked about the fathers of their unborn children, both girls pointed to Jacob, their 19-year-old brother. Delilah interrupted, explaining matter-of-factly, "That's how it's always been done. The boys take care of the girls. They keep it in the family." Dr. Chun also discovered that Martha, the 17-year-old, was not pregnant for the first time. She'd given birth 2 years earlier to a child who had lived only 3 days, dying from what Delilah described as breathing problems. The baby, never registered with any official agency, was buried in the family cemetery. When Dr. Chun asked if they had sought medical help, Delilah shook her head. "We handled it ourselves. The Lord decides who lives and who dies." As the medical examinations continued, Margaret and the other social workers documented the living conditions in detail. The house had no indoor plumbing. Water was drawn from a well that appeared contaminated based on the greenish tinge of the water and the strong mineral smell. The outhouse was located about 50 feet from the main dwelling, a crude wooden structure that barely provided shelter. In November, with temperatures dropping into the 20s at night, using the outdoor facility would have been extremely difficult for family members with mobility issues. The house had electricity available from power lines that reached the property, but the Calloway family had never connected to them. Delilah explained that her father had refused to allow government electricity into the house, believing it would bring outside influence and corruption. They relied instead on kerosene lamps and candles for light, and a wood-burning stove for heat and cooking. Food supplies were minimal. The family survived primarily on cornmeal, dried beans, and occasional wild game that the more capable men could hunt. They kept a few chickens, but egg production was low due to the birds' poor health and the family's inability to properly care for them. Dr. Chun estimated that most family members were severely malnourished, their diets lacking in essential vitamins and minerals necessary for proper development, especially crucial for the growing children and pregnant teenagers. Sheriff McCormick explored the property while the medical examinations continued. He discovered several concerning items: improvised restraints in one of the back rooms, crude rope and leather straps that Delilah explained were necessary to keep the troubled ones from hurting themselves. He found a locked room that contained what appeared to be a teenage boy, approximately 16 years old, who screamed and thrashed violently when anyone approached. Delilah explained that this was her grandson, Elijah, who had devil fits and needed to be kept confined for his own safety and the safety of others. Dr. Chun immediately recognized this as likely epilepsy, a condition known to occur with higher frequency in populations with high rates of consanguinity. Without proper medication or medical intervention, Elijah's seizures had gone uncontrolled for his entire life. The isolation he experienced, locked in a dark room for most of each day, had undoubtedly caused additional psychological trauma. As the investigation team prepared to leave late that afternoon, they held a conference in their vehicles, away from the house. The consensus was unanimous. Immediate intervention was necessary. The children needed medical care, proper nutrition, education, and protection from continued exposure to an environment that was perpetuating their suffering. The pregnant teenagers needed prenatal care and counseling. The adults with treatable conditions needed access to proper medical facilities. But Sheriff McCormick raised a practical concern that would complicate everything. Where exactly are we going to place 11 people, most of whom have severe disabilities? Our county doesn't have the facilities. The nearest institution that could handle this is 3 counties away, and they're already overcrowded. And legally, removing adults who aren't deemed incompetent is problematic, even if the situation is terrible. Dr. Chun proposed a compromise. They would begin by focusing on the children and the pregnant teenagers, who were clearly at immediate risk. A hearing would be scheduled in family court to determine custody. Meanwhile, they would try to establish some basic services at the property, connecting the electricity, providing medical supplies, arranging for regular visits from health workers. Margaret disagreed strongly. "Doctor, you're talking about putting a bandage on a wound that needs surgery. If we leave the adults there, and if we eventually have to return these children to that environment, we're just perpetuating the cycle. Those pregnant girls will have babies with severe genetic problems, and those babies will grow up in the same isolation. And in 15 or 20 years, they'll reproduce with their siblings or cousins. And it will continue." The debate continued until darkness fell. Finally, they agreed on a staged approach. The immediate priority was emergency medical care. The most severely affected children would be taken to the county hospital that evening for evaluation and treatment. The pregnant teenagers would also be hospitalized for prenatal assessment. A court hearing would be scheduled within the week to determine longer-term custody arrangements. When they returned to the house to explain their decision, the reaction was more volatile than expected. Delilah became agitated, shouting that they had no right to split up the family. "You people don't understand," she screamed, her voice cracking with emotion. "We're all we have. You take them away and what happens to us? We die up here alone, that's what happens." Jacob, the 19-year-old who had fathered his sister's children, became aggressive, grabbing a hunting rifle from beside the door. Sheriff McCormick immediately drew his weapon, and for several tense minutes the situation teetered on the edge of violence. Finally, Dr. Chun stepped between them, his hands raised in a calming gesture. "Jacob, we're not your enemies. Your brother Samuel, the 2-year-old, he's dying. Do you understand that? Without medical help, he won't live to see his 3rd birthday. Your sisters, Sarah and Martha, they're carrying babies that might not survive without proper medical care. We're trying to save lives here, not destroy your family." Whether it was Dr. Chun's words or the reality of the loaded guns pointed at each other, the tension finally broke. Jacob lowered his rifle. Delilah collapsed into a chair, sobbing. The rest of the family members, many of whom had watched the confrontation with confused expressions, remained motionless. That night, 3 vehicles made the 2-hour journey back to Harlan. Margaret rode with Sarah and Martha, the pregnant teenagers, trying to comfort them as they cried for their family. Dr. Chun transported Samuel, Ruth, and Caleb, the 3 youngest and most severely impaired children, monitoring their vital signs throughout the journey. Sheriff McCormick brought Elijah, the epileptic teenager who had been kept in isolation. Sedated with medication Dr. Chun had administered to prevent seizures during the transport. At the hospital, the night shift staff were shocked by what they saw. The emergency room physician, Dr. Patricia Williams, later testified that in her 15 years of medical practice, she had never encountered such a concentrated presentation of genetic disorders in a single family group. The children were immediately admitted, beginning a process of medical intervention that would reveal just how deep the damage from 7 generations of inbreeding truly went. The family court hearing convened on November 27, 1978. In the Harlan County Courthouse, a red brick building that had stood in the town square since 1892, Judge Harold Morrison, a 62-year-old jurist who had presided over family court for 23 years, called the case at 9 a.m. The courtroom was closed to the public due to the sensitive nature of the testimony, but a court reporter documented every word, creating a transcript that would become a critical historical document in understanding the Calloway case. The state's case was presented by Assistant District Attorney Carol Patterson, a 35-year-old prosecutor who had handled numerous child welfare cases, but nothing that approached the complexity of the Calloway situation. She called Dr. Robert Chun as her first witness. Dr. Chun took the stand carrying a folder nearly 3 inches thick, containing medical reports, photographs, and genetic analysis that had been conducted over the previous 9 days. His testimony would last nearly 4 hours, and would paint the most complete medical picture of the family that had yet been assembled. "Your Honor, Doctor," Chun began, "what we are dealing with is the cumulative effect of approximately 7 generations of systematic consanguineous reproduction. The medical term is inbreeding depression, but that clinical language fails to capture the human tragedy we've documented." He explained that he had coordinated with specialists from the University of Kentucky Medical Center to analyze blood samples from the family members. While DNA analysis as we know it today was not yet available in 1978, blood typing, chromosome analysis, and other genetic markers could still reveal significant information about relatedness and genetic disorders. The findings were damning. The children showed elevated frequencies of autosomal recessive disorders, conditions that only manifest when an individual inherits 2 copies of a defective gene, one from each parent. In normal populations, these conditions are rare because the likelihood of 2 unrelated people both carrying the same recessive mutation is low. But in the Calloway family, where the gene pool had been restricted for generations, these mutations had become concentrated. Dr. Chun testified about Samuel, the 2-year-old boy who couldn't walk or speak. Further examination had revealed that he suffered from a severe form of metabolic disorder, likely homocystinuria, which affects the body's ability to process certain amino acids. Left untreated, the condition causes intellectual disability, skeletal abnormalities, and often early death. With proper medical interventions started in infancy, children with this condition can live relatively normal lives, Dr. Chun explained. But Samuel has received no treatment. The damage to his brain and body is likely irreversible. The testimony moved to Ruth and Caleb, the 4- and 6-year-olds. Both children suffered from profound hearing loss. likely due to a genetic condition called Waardenburg syndrome, which can cause deafness along with distinctive facial features and pigmentation abnormalities. Neither child had ever been exposed to sign language or any form of communication training. They existed in a world of silence, unable to express their needs or understand the world around them. Dr. Chun then discussed the skeletal abnormalities seen throughout the family. He displayed X-rays showing the fused vertebrae, the malformed long bones, the abnormal skull structures. These are conditions consistent with several genetic syndromes. But the clustering we see in this family suggests multiple genetic factors at work. Each generation of inbreeding increases the probability that harmful mutations will be expressed in the offspring. The courtroom fell silent as Dr. Chun presented photographs of the children. Judge Morrison requested that the photographs not be shown to anyone beyond the court officials and attorneys, recognizing that the images were deeply disturbing. The photos documented the physical manifestations of genetic disorders, the severely protruding foreheads, the eyes set far apart, the cleft palates, the twisted spines and limbs. When testimony turned to the pregnant teenagers, Sarah and Martha, Dr. Chun's voice took on an even more somber tone. Both young women are malnourished and anemic. Sarah, who is approximately 5 months pregnant, is carrying a fetus that preliminary ultrasound suggests has significant abnormalities, including possible neural tube defects and skeletal malformations. Martha, who is approximately 7 months pregnant, shows signs of preeclampsia, a dangerous condition that threatens both her life and the life of her unborn child. Dr. Chun explained that the medical team had counseled both teenagers about their options, but given their advanced stages of pregnancy and their own intellectual limitations, they were continuing the pregnancies under close medical supervision. The likelihood that either of these children will be born healthy is extremely low, he testified. Not the genetic burden they carry, being the product of siblings, virtually guarantees significant health problems. The prosecutor then called Margaret Henderson to testify about the social conditions and the family dynamics she had observed. Margaret described the isolation of the property, the absence of education for the children, the lack of basic medical care, and the ongoing practice of reproduction between close relatives. Mrs. Calloway, the matriarch, has told me explicitly that this is their way of life, that keeping the family bloodline pure is essential to their identity, Margaret testified, when I tried to explain the medical consequences. She responded that the weak children die and the strong ones survive, and that this is God's will. There is no recognition that the suffering these children endure is preventable. No willingness to accept outside intervention. Margaret also testified about the financial situation. The family had no income beyond a small disability check that Delilah received, approximately $270 per month, which was clearly insufficient to support 11 people. They had no health insurance, no access to social services, and no connection to any community support systems. The defense attorney, a court-appointed lawyer named Richard Holbrook, had been assigned to represent the adult Calloway family members. He faced an almost impossible task, defending their right to maintain custody of the children while acknowledging the obvious harm the children were suffering. Holbrook called Delilah Calloway to the stand. At 76 years old, walking with her pronounced limp and requiring assistance to climb into the witness box, Delilah cut a sympathetic figure despite the horrifying practices she had perpetuated. Mrs. Calloway, Holbrook began gently, can you explain to the court why your family has lived in such isolation for so many generations? Delilah's testimony provided some historical context that hadn't been fully understood before. She spoke in her thick Appalachian accent, her words sometimes difficult for the court reporter to transcribe accurately. She described how her grandfather had told her stories of betrayal and persecution by neighboring families in the late 1800s, how the Calloways had been accused of theft and had faced threats of violence. My granddaddy said they tried to run us off our land, Delilah testified. Said we didn't belong there, that we were trash. So we stopped going to their town, stopped asking them for anything. We made our own way. And my daddy taught us that family is all you can trust. Outsiders bring nothing but trouble. When asked about the practice of close relatives having children together, Delilah's response revealed a worldview shaped by generations of isolation and limited education. We didn't see nothing wrong with it, she said. The Bible talks about brothers and sisters in the early days, doesn't it? We kept our family strong by keeping it together. We didn't want strangers coming in, taking our land, corrupting our ways. Prosecutor Patterson cross-examined Delilah, pressing her on the infant mortality rate and the obvious suffering of the surviving children. Mrs. Calloway, you testified that most babies born in your family don't survive their first year. Doesn't that suggest to you that something is seriously wrong? Delilah's response was chilling in its simplicity. The weak ones die. The strong ones live. That's nature's way. We can't all be strong. And the children who survive but can't walk, can't talk, can't take care of themselves, you don't see that as suffering? Delilah was quiet for a long moment before answering. They're loved. They're cared for. That's more than a lot of children get. The testimony continued for 3 days. Medical experts, social workers, and even a geneticist from the University of Kentucky all testified about the dangers of consanguinity and the long-term prognosis for the Calloway children. The geneticist, Dr. Elizabeth Thornton, explained that the coefficient of inbreeding in the family was so high that it was comparable to what researchers had observed in isolated island populations and in certain royal families in history where uncle-niece and first-cousin marriages were common. The genetic load, the accumulation of harmful mutations, becomes insurmountable after several generations, Dr. Thornton testified. We see increased rates of every category of genetic disorder, metabolic diseases, skeletal abnormalities, sensory deficits, intellectual disabilities, immune system problems, and increased cancer rates. The Calloway family represents an extreme example of what happens when a gene pool becomes too restricted. On the third day of testimony, something unexpected happened. Jacob Calloway, the 19-year-old father of his sister's children, appeared at the courthouse without notice. He had walked the 2-hour journey from the family property, arriving disheveled and agitated. He demanded to be heard. Judge Morrison, after consulting with the attorneys, allowed Jacob to make a statement. What followed was one of the most poignant moments in the entire proceeding. Jacob stood before the court, barely literate, intellectually limited, but speaking from a place of genuine emotion. I don't understand all this talk about genes and disorders, he said, his voice shaking. I just know that Sarah and Martha are my sisters and I love them. The babies they're carrying are my babies and I want to take care of them. Nobody never taught me that what we was doing was wrong. Mrs. Delilah said it was our way, and I believed her. He continued, tears streaming down his face, but I've been thinking about little Samuel, how he can't walk or talk, and I've been thinking about all the babies buried in our cemetery, and I'm starting to think maybe you all are right. Maybe we did something terrible without knowing it was terrible. I don't want my babies to suffer like Samuel is suffering. I don't want them to die like the others died. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Even the judge, who had maintained professional composure throughout the disturbing testimony, appeared moved. Jacob's statement revealed what many had suspected. The Calloway family members were not malicious or intentionally cruel. They were themselves victims of isolation, limited education, and a cultural practice that had been normalized over generations. At this strategic moment, the weight of what Jacob said settles over everyone present. His words echo what so many people fail to see in cases like these. The perpetrators are victims too, caught in cycles they never chose and never understood. Say this in the comments. These families never meant to cause harm. They were trapped by ignorance, not evil. Judge Morrison called for a recess to consider all of the testimony. When court resumed the following morning, he delivered his ruling. This case represents one of the most difficult decisions I have faced in my career on the bench, Judge Morrison began. We are confronting the intersection of individual liberty, family autonomy, child welfare, and public health. The evidence presented is overwhelming that the children in the Calloway family have suffered significant harm due to the genetic consequences of consanguineous reproduction and due to the neglectful conditions in which they've been raised. The judge ordered that all minor children be removed from the custody of the Calloway family and placed in state care. The 3 youngest children would remain in medical facilities where they could receive ongoing treatment. The older children would be placed in foster care with the requirement that they receive educational services, medical care, and psychological counseling. For Sarah and Martha, the pregnant teenagers, the judge's decision was more nuanced. They would remain in medical care through the completion of their pregnancies. After giving birth, they would undergo evaluation to determine their capacity to parent their children. If deemed incapable, the infants would be placed for adoption. Judge Morrison also issued an order that shocked everyone in the courtroom. He mandated that all adult Calloway family members of reproductive age undergo counseling about reproduction and family planning, and he strongly recommended, though could not legally require, that they consider voluntary sterilization to prevent future generations from suffering the same genetic burden. This family has endured 7 generations of a practice that has caused immeasurable suffering, Judge Morrison stated in his conclusion. While I cannot undo the past, I can act to protect the future. These children deserve the opportunity to live healthy lives, to receive education, to have access to medical care, and to make their own informed choices about reproduction when they reach adulthood. The cycle must end here. The ruling was comprehensive and, for 1978, remarkably forward-thinking in its recognition of the genetic dimensions of the case. But implementation would prove far more complicated than the court order suggested. The months following Judge Morrison's ruling revealed just how ill-equipped the Kentucky social services system was to handle a case of this magnitude. The Callaway children, each with complex medical and developmental needs, required specialized care that simply wasn't available in rural Appalachia in 1979. Samuel, the 2-year-old with the metabolic disorder, remained hospitalized for 3 months. Despite aggressive medical intervention, the damage to his system was too extensive. On February 14, 1979, Valentine's Day, Samuel died of complications related to his untreated condition and the cascading failures it had caused in his kidneys and liver. He was 2 years and 4 months old. His death certificate listed the immediate cause as renal failure, but Dr. Chun in his personal notes wrote, "This child's death was entirely preventable. With newborn screening and early intervention, he could have lived a normal lifespan. Instead, he paid the price for generations of isolation and ignorance." The other young children, Ruth and Caleb, were placed in a specialized care facility in Lexington, nearly 3 hours from Harlan County. The facility had experience with deaf and developmentally disabled children, and the staff began the slow process of teaching them basic communication skills. Ruth, at 4 years old, showed some capacity to learn sign language, though her cognitive delays meant progress was measured in tiny increments. Caleb, at 6, struggled more significantly. His profound intellectual disability, combined with his hearing loss and years of neglect, meant he would likely require institutional care for his entire life. The older children, those aged 7 to 14, were placed in various foster homes around the county. This arrangement quickly proved problematic. Foster parents who had agreed to take these children often found themselves overwhelmed by the medical needs, behavioral issues, and psychological trauma the children carried. Within 6 months, 3 of the placements had failed, with foster parents requesting that the children be removed from their homes. One particularly tragic case involved 9-year-old Rebecca Callaway, who had been placed with a family in Harlan. Rebecca had severe trust issues, having spent her entire life in the isolated family compound. She refused to speak, refused to eat meals with the family, and spent most of her time hiding in closets or under beds. When the foster mother tried to enroll her in school, Rebecca had violent outbursts, screaming and physically attacking other children. A psychological evaluation revealed that Rebecca functioned at approximately the level of a 4-year-old and displayed symptoms consistent with severe attachment disorder and possible developmental trauma. The school system didn't know how to handle children like Rebecca and the other Callaway kids. In 1979, special education services in rural Kentucky were minimal. The Education for All Handicapped Children Act had been passed in 1975, but implementation was slow, especially in poor rural districts. Most of the Callaway children who were school-age ended up in segregated classrooms with minimal instruction, essentially warehoused rather than educated. Meanwhile, Sarah and Martha, the pregnant teenagers, gave birth in December 1978 and February 1979, respectively. Sarah's baby, a girl she named Hope, was born with severe spina bifida, a neural tube defect that left her paralyzed from the waist down. The child also had hydrocephalus, an accumulation of fluid in the brain, requiring immediate surgery to implant a shunt. Hope survived the surgery but faced a lifetime of medical complications and disability. Martha's baby, a boy she wanted to name Thomas after her brother, lived only 18 hours. The infant was born with multiple severe abnormalities, a malformed heart with only 3 chambers instead of 4, kidneys that had not properly developed, and a cleft palate so severe that he could not feed. The medical team made the baby as comfortable as possible, but there was nothing they could do to save him. Martha held her son as he died, and witnesses reported that she screamed for hours afterward, a sound of grief so raw that hospital staff would remember it years later. The psychological evaluation determined that neither Sarah nor Martha had the cognitive capacity to independently parent their children. Sarah, at 15, functioned at approximately the level of a 9-year-old. Martha, at 17, was slightly more capable but still significantly intellectually disabled. The state moved to terminate their parental rights and place baby Hope for adoption. Finding an adoptive family for a severely disabled infant proved nearly impossible. Hope spent the first 3 years of her life in a pediatric nursing facility, undergoing multiple surgeries and medical interventions. Eventually, she was adopted by a couple from Louisville who had experience with disabled children. But the early years of institutional care had already affected her development in ways that would never be fully overcome. Back at the Calloway property, the remaining adult family members struggled to survive without the children. The state had arranged for electricity to be connected and had delivered supplies to improve the living conditions. But the family remained resistant to outside interference. Delilah, now 77 years old and in declining health, told visiting social workers that she felt like she had been gutted, like they took out my insides and left me hollow. Jacob, the 19-year-old father, fell into a severe depression. He had been told that both of his children with his sisters had serious health problems and one had died. The counseling sessions about reproduction that Judge Morrison had mandated were largely ineffective because Jacob's intellectual limitations made it difficult for him to fully grasp the genetic concepts being explained. He understood that he had done something wrong, that he had hurt people he loved, but the specifics of why and how remained beyond his comprehension. In April 1979, tragedy struck again. Jacob was found dead in the barn on the Calloway property. The county coroner ruled the death a suicide by hanging. He left no note, having never learned to write beyond his own name. Those who had interacted with him in the months before his death reported that he had spoken repeatedly about wanting to make things right and about feeling that he had ruined everything. His death at 19 years old represented another casualty of the family's genetic and social isolation. The legal and medical communities in Kentucky began to grapple with the broader implications of the Calloway case. At the University of Kentucky, researchers proposed a study to document other isolated families in Appalachia who might be at risk for similar patterns of consanguinity. The proposal was ultimately rejected due to ethical concerns about how such research could be conducted without causing further harm to already vulnerable populations. In the medical literature, the Calloway case was written up in several journals, though names and some identifying details were changed to protect privacy. One article in the American Journal of Medical Genetics, published in 1981, used the Calloway family as a case study in the long-term effects of systematic inbreeding. The authors concluded this case demonstrates that human populations, like all biological populations, cannot sustain long-term reproduction within a restricted gene pool without severe consequences. The accumulation of deleterious recessive alleles over 7 generations created a genetic burden that manifested in elevated infant mortality, multiple congenital abnormalities, and significantly reduced quality of life for survivors. The article sparked a debate in the medical and ethics communities about the balance between family autonomy and state intervention. Some argued that the state should have intervened earlier, that there were undoubtedly warning signs over the generations that had been ignored. Others countered that the isolation of families like the Calloways made early detection nearly impossible, and that even when intervention occurred, the systems in place to help were inadequate. By 1980, most of the Calloway children who had been removed from the family were in long-term placements, either in institutional settings or in stable foster homes. The outcomes varied dramatically. Some of the children with less severe disabilities made progress with education and medical care, learning basic skills and achieving some degree of independence. Others remained profoundly disabled, requiring care for their entire lives. The adult family members who remained at the Calloway property dwindled in number. Several of the elderly members died between 1979 and 1982, including Delilah, who passed away in her sleep in January 1981 at age 79. Her obituary in the local newspaper was brief. Delilah Calloway, longtime resident of Harlan County, died peacefully at her home. She is survived by several children and grandchildren. There was no mention of the family's notoriety, no reference to the case that had drawn state intervention. By 1985, only 3 adult Calloway family members remained on the property, 2 brothers in their 40s and their cousin, a woman in her 50s. All 3 had significant disabilities but were legally competent to live independently. They survived on disability payments and occasional help from a community outreach program that had been established partly in response to the Calloway case. The children who had been removed grew into adulthood bearing the physical and psychological scars of their origins. Some maintained contact with each other, forming a support network of siblings and cousins who shared the unique trauma of their family history. Others tried to distance themselves from their past, changing their names and moving away from Kentucky to start new lives where no one knew their story. Rebecca, the girl who had struggled so much in foster care, eventually found stability in a group home for adults with developmental disabilities. She learned to communicate through a combination of basic sign language and simple spoken phrases. She never fully overcame the trauma of her early years, but with consistent patient support, she found a measure of peace. The youngest survivors, those who had been removed from the family as toddlers or infants, had better outcomes. Separated from the Callaway environment early and placed in stable homes, they received medical care, education, and therapy that allowed them to develop as much as their genetic limitations permitted. Some were able to attend regular schools with support services. A few even went on to hold jobs and live semi-independently as adults. But the shadow of their origins never entirely disappeared. Medical problems continued throughout their lives. Skeletal abnormalities caused chronic pain and mobility issues. The metabolic disorders required lifelong monitoring and treatment. The cognitive limitations, while manageable with support, meant that none of the Callaway children would ever achieve full independence. In 1990, a follow-up study tracked down 18 surviving Callaway family members who had been children at the time of the intervention. Of those 18, 4 had died in the intervening years, 3 from complications related to their genetic conditions. Of the 14 survivors, 9 were living in institutional or group home settings. 3 were in supported living arrangements with family members or paid caregivers. And only 2 were living independently, though both received ongoing support services. The study concluded, the intervention in 1978 likely prevented additional generations of genetic deterioration and saved some children from the most severe outcomes. However, the damage from 7 generations of consanguinity could not be reversed. The surviving Callaway children will carry the burden of their genetic heritage for their entire lives, as will any children they may have, though none of the surviving family members have chosen to reproduce. This last point was significant. Of all the Callaway children who reached reproductive age after the intervention, not a single one chose to have children, whether this was due to the counseling they received, their own understanding of the risks, their disabilities that limited relationship opportunities, or some combination of these factors. The effect was the same. The Callaway bloodline effectively ended with the generation that was alive in 1978. The property itself, that isolated 40 acres in the Appalachian Mountains where 7 generations had lived and died, eventually reverted to the county for unpaid taxes in 1992. The house, uninhabited since the last family members moved to assisted living facilities, gradually deteriorated. The roof collapsed in the late 1990s, and by the early 2000s, the structure was little more than a pile of rotting wood and rusted metal, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. The family cemetery remained, though many of the crude wooden markers had rotted away or been knocked over by falling branches. The dozens of graves, most of them infants and children who never had a chance at life, stood as silent testimony to the cost of isolation and the dangers of genetic insularity. As the 21st century began, the Callaway case had largely faded from public memory. The children who had been removed from the family were now middle-aged adults, scattered across Kentucky and beyond. The property where they had lived was an overgrown ruin, but for those who studied genetics, medical ethics, and social services, the Callaway family remained a touchstone, a case study in what could go wrong when isolation, poverty, and cultural practices combined to create a perfect storm of genetic catastrophe. Dr. Robert Chun, the physician who had first examined the family in 1978, retired from medical practice in 2005. In his retirement, he wrote a memoir that included a chapter on the Callaway case. He reflected on what had been learned and what had been lost. We intervened to save the children, Dr. Chun wrote, but I have often wondered if we did enough, or if we could have done more. The systems we had in place were inadequate for the complexity of their needs. We removed them from one form of suffering only to place them in others. Institutional neglect, failed foster placements, schools that didn't know how to teach them, communities that didn't want to understand them. He continued, the Callaway case taught me that poverty and isolation are as much a public health crisis as any disease. If that family had not been so geographically and socially isolated, if they had had access to education, to medical care, to outside perspectives, the tragedy might have been prevented. But we as a society allowed them to exist in a pocket of neglect for over a century. And by the time we intervened, generations of damage had already been done. Margaret Henderson, the social worker who had first discovered the family, also reflected on the case in her later years. In an interview conducted in 2010 for a documentary on rural poverty in Appalachia, she was asked what she would have done differently. Everything and nothing, Margaret responded. Everything, because clearly our intervention, while necessary, was imperfect. The children deserved better than what we were able to provide. Nothing, because I genuinely don't know what else we could have done with the resources we had. The Callaway case exposed how unprepared our systems were to deal with this level of genetic and social crisis, she added. With visible emotion, even 32 years after the initial discovery, I still think about those children every day. I think about little Samuel, who died at 2 years old. And I think about how with proper newborn screening and treatment, he could have lived a normal life. I think about Jacob, who took his own life because he couldn't live with what he had unknowingly done. I think about all those tiny graves in that cemetery, babies who never had a chance. And I wonder how many other families are out there, hidden away in isolated pockets of poverty, suffering in silence because we haven't found them yet. The scientific community continued to study the genetic implications of the Calloway case, with advances in DNA sequencing and genetic analysis in the 1990s and 2000s. Researchers were able to analyze stored blood samples and tissue samples from the family members with far greater precision than had been possible in 1978. A landmark study published in 2008 in the journal Human Genetics analyzed the Calloway family's genetic makeup in detail. The researchers found that the family members shared genetic sequences to an extent rarely seen in human populations. The level of homozygosity, where individuals have 2 identical copies of genes rather than 2 different versions, was approximately 40% across the genome, more than double what would be expected even in offspring of first-degree relatives. The study identified multiple recessive mutations that had become fixed in the population, meaning everyone in the family carried 2 copies. These included mutations affecting skeletal development, neurological function, metabolic pathways, and immune system function. The researchers calculated that the effective population size of the Calloway family had been approximately 2.3 individuals, meaning the genetic diversity of the entire family was equivalent to what you would expect from just over 2 unrelated people. This represents one of the most extreme cases of inbreeding depression ever documented in a human population outside of scientific literature on historical royal families, the lead author wrote. The Calloway family demonstrates that humans, despite our cultural and technological advantages, are subject to the same biological laws that govern all organisms. Genetic diversity is not optional. It is essential for population health. The study also addressed a controversial question. Could the Calloway family have recovered if the practice of consanguinity had been stopped earlier? Computer modeling suggested that even if the family had immediately begun reproducing with unrelated individuals after just 3 or 4 generations of inbreeding, it would have taken several generations for the genetic burden to be diluted to near normal levels. After 7 generations, the accumulation of harmful mutations was so extensive that complete genetic recovery would have been virtually impossible without introducing genetic material from many unrelated individuals over multiple generations. In the realm of public policy, the Calloway case influenced several important changes in Kentucky and other Appalachian states. In 1982, Kentucky passed legislation requiring that teachers and healthcare providers receive training in recognizing signs of child neglect and genetic disorders. The law also mandated that school districts provide special education services to children with developmental disabilities, with state funding to support these programs. In 1985, Kentucky established a program of outreach social workers, specifically tasked with identifying isolated families in rural areas and connecting them with services. The program was chronically underfunded, but it did succeed in identifying several families living in conditions similar to the Calloways, though none with the same degree of genetic deterioration. The medical community also responded. By the mid-1980s, genetic counseling services became more widely available in Kentucky, particularly in regions where isolated populations were known to exist. While these services couldn't undo generations of damage, they could prevent future cases by educating families about the risks of consanguineous reproduction. Perhaps the most significant legacy of the Calloway case was its impact on how we understand the intersection of poverty, isolation, and genetics. The case demonstrated that genetic disasters don't happen in a vacuum. They are the result of social conditions, geographic isolation, lack of education, absence of medical care, and economic deprivation that makes families turn inward rather than reaching out to the broader community. By 2015, only 7 members of the original Calloway family discovered in 1978 were still alive. They ranged in age from their late 30s to mid-50s. Most lived in assisted care facilities, their lives shaped entirely by the genetic lottery they had lost before they were even born. They worked simple jobs when they were able, attended day programs, received ongoing medical care for chronic conditions, and lived quiet lives far removed from the tragedy of their origins. One of the survivors, a woman named Emma, who had been 12 years old when removed from the family, agreed to speak with a journalist in 2018 for a retrospective article on the case. Emma had been one of the more fortunate ones. Her disabilities were primarily physical rather than cognitive. She had severe scoliosis that required her to use a wheelchair, but her mind was sharp. "People think we were monsters," Emma said during the interview. "They hear about brothers and sisters having babies together and they think we were evil or perverted, but we didn't know. We truly didn't know it was wrong. We were taught that family stays together, that outsiders couldn't be trusted, that our way was the right way. When they took us away, I was terrified. I thought the social workers were kidnapping us, that they were the bad people. It took years before I understood they were saving us." She continued, her voice breaking with emotion. "But I'm angry too. Angry that we were allowed to exist like that for so long. There were people who knew, neighbors who saw us, who knew something was wrong, but they didn't want to get involved. The government knew there were isolated families in these mountains, but they didn't have the resources or the will to reach us. We paid the price for society's neglect just as much as we paid the price for our family's choices." When asked what she wanted people to learn from her family story, Emma's response was direct. "Don't turn away from suffering because it's uncomfortable or difficult. Don't let families disappear into isolation where terrible things can happen in secret. And understand that genetic health requires diversity. We thought we were keeping our family strong by keeping it pure, but we were destroying ourselves. That's the truth that needs to be told." The journalist asked Emma if she had ever considered having children. She shook her head firmly. "I made the decision when I was 18 that I would never have children. Even if I married someone from outside the family, I carried too many damaged genes. I wouldn't risk passing this burden to another generation. The suffering ends with me and my siblings. That's the only power we have to make sure no one else has to live like we did." By 2020, the Calloway family property had been completely reclaimed by nature. The Kentucky Department of Parks considered turning the site into a memorial or educational center, but the idea was ultimately rejected as too controversial. The family cemetery, however, was preserved and maintained by a historical society, with a simple marker installed in 2019 that read, "In memory of the Calloway family. May their story serve as a reminder of the importance of community, education, and the dangers of isolation." The last surviving member of the original generation, an elderly woman who had been in her 60s when the family was discovered in 1978, died in 2021 at the age of 104. She had spent the last 43 years of her life in a nursing home, separated from the property where she had spent her first 61 years. In her final years, she suffered from dementia and rarely spoke. But nurses reported that sometimes, in moments of clarity, she would talk about the mountain, the family, and the old ways. She would say that they had been happy in their own way, one nurse recalled. That they hadn't known they were doing anything wrong. She grieved for the children who had been taken away, grieved for the babies who had died, grieved for the life they had lost. But she also seemed to understand toward the end that it had to happen, that the suffering had to stop. Today, the Calloway case is taught in medical schools, social work programs, and genetics courses across the country. It appears in textbooks as a case study in inbreeding depression, in ethics classes as an example of the challenges of balancing individual rights with public welfare, and in social policy discussions about rural poverty and isolation. The story of the Calloway family is a tragedy that unfolded over 7 generations, affecting dozens of lives, ending in early graves for many, and leaving permanent scars on the survivors. It is a story of how isolation can destroy, how poverty can trap, and how ignorance can perpetuate suffering across generations. But it is also a story of intervention, of people who cared enough to act, and of the resilience of children who survived the unimaginable and built lives despite carrying burdens they never should have had to bear. The genetic legacy of the Calloway family died with them. None of the survivors chose to have children. And the bloodline that had persisted since 1847 ended in the early 21st century. But the lessons of their story live on, a powerful reminder that in a civilized society, no family should ever be so isolated that they suffer in silence. And no child should ever pay the price for the choices and circumstances of the generations that came before them. The inbred family of the Appalachian Hills, 7 generations trapped by a cursed genetic bloodline. A story that began with isolation ended with extinction. But in that ending, perhaps there was a kind of mercy, the mercy of preventing future generations from inheriting a legacy of suffering that should never have existed in the first place.